Welcome to the church library. Draw up a chair and join us as we sort through these stacks of old books. I'm Marissa Burt.
And I'm Kelsey McGinnis. And here in the church library, we host conversations about popular Christian books. This season, we are dusting off Christian parenting resources.
Our book, The Myth of Good Christian Parenting, How False Promises Betrayed a Generation of Evangelical Families, examines many of these books, the obscure, the bestsellers, the ones that still pop up in church parenting classes.
Let's see what's on the bookshelves today. Hello, Marissa.
Hello, Kelsey. It's so good to see you today.
It's good to see you too. It's a beautiful day here in Iowa. How is it in Washington?
It's lovely. It's summer. We finally have summer and sun and everything that comes with. So everyone's outside, wants to be outside. Flowers are blooming. It's gorgeous.
Same. We did our first pool day this week, the first of many. And my 7-year-old went off the diving board for the first time this week, which was a very big deal. So we're in like a new phase of pool parenting, which I feel like is going to be more stressful because she's going to want to be in the deep end. And I've still got a 3-year-old who can't swim. So I'm going to need reinforcements.
Yeah.
Every time we're at the pool, it will be reinforcements. So
that's amazing. Well, I'm so glad we're here to do part 2 of our question and answers.
Me too. I love reading these questions.
Yeah, these are great.
Yeah. So thank you all for sending them in. We got, I don't know, how many questions did we get through last time? 4?
Maybe 4.
Maybe 4? Okay.
I think some of these might go fast. There are a few here that'll be quicker.
Yes, we will try. We will try to get through them more quickly. But we will keep on answering them as they come in because more questions keep coming in, which is fantastic. We love it. And most of them are very thoughtful questions. So thank you.
They are really great.
So first question, how do you both internally and externally, handle criticism from Christians of your toddlers displaying developmentally appropriate but situationally inappropriate behaviors that children trained under authoritarianism typically don't do? Struggling to know how to respond to critiques and internally manage my desire to people please. That is a hard question. Yeah. That's a really hard question. And I think there is this misconception, though, that children raised in more authoritarian families are uniformly better behaved. I know that there is research showing that, children who are spanked are more like children who are there's research that shows that even children who are spanked are not necessarily better behaved, right? So I think there is a little bit of a misconception there.
Well, and often some research shows, in fact, that spanking contributes to poor behavioral control later on as well. That is a misconception. And also, I totally get it. Because when you're in Christian environments where it's like, oh, children have been trained to instantly obey or comply, that's a marked difference from parents who maybe aren't placing behavioral management as the end goal of their parenting. Like it's such a different paradigm. I mean, this seems more like a personal question, like how have we managed it? I mean, speaking as a mom, it's always there. I think it's been a while since I've had toddlers, but there's always that sense of there's always going to be people who think you're doing it wrong or don't agree with what you're doing or are making assumptions about what you're doing or about your children. And that can be uncomfortable, but is kind of just a reality of parenting other human beings who are going to do what they're going to do. And they're not thinking, how does this reflect on my family? They just don't have that filter.
Yeah. I mean, I will say it used to shake me a lot more than it does now. And I think just as I would never assume if I see like a well-behaved I'm putting quotes in here, a quiet, still toddler. I would not assume that toddler had been spanked a lot, right? Like a lot of this is temperament. And people assuming that if you have a loud, sometimes out of control toddler, that it's because you aren't spanking them.
Right.
or coming down hard enough on that
Mm-hmm.
kind of behavior. And that isn't true. That's kind of the conception the misconception I was trying to get at a second ago. I think that has helped for me to like internalize that belief in myself that like I really don't know. I can't assume something about a child's how they're being disciplined
Mm-hmm.
just by their behavior in public. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's one thing. I also think like I I just try not, and this is so much easier said than done, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
but I've tried to really stop looking at other parents and adults around me at all to see how they're responding to my parenting.
Yes.
Because I think a lot of the time the anxiety is actually less about like
Yes.
their perception of my kid than their perception of me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the more I've just worked on, I'm not here for anybody else here
Mm-hmm.
right now. Like if my kid is having a meltdown, I'm here for my kid,
Yeah.
and that's all. Like,
Yes.
again, I don't have like a system in place for that or anything, but that's how I try to deal with it internally. And I think just learning to be okay with, and if that means that the people around me think I'm a pushover parent or think I'm not coming down hard enough on this behavior, I need to not care about that in that moment, you know?
Yeah, I think that's helpful. I mean, I think it's understandably very challenging for parents who were raised in environments where they were expected to be perfectly behaved to then be parenting in a new way and feel like not only is their child misbehaving, but they are parenting wrongly
Mhm.
because there was so much scrutiny on behavior. So it really makes sense that that would be triggering in a very real sense. And it could be like if you're in a Christian community that highly values that, there very well may be people judging. I think also a lot of people aren't. They're thinking about their own things, their own children, stuff like that. They're maybe looking over, but sometimes people are judging and they will even say it or critique. And maybe they're asking that. I mean, I think having stock answers to respond, if you're in a community that verbalizes critique, often it can be helpful to have a few stock answers in your back pocket of just like, oh, well, thanks for that input. I feel confident in what I'm doing, or whatever you're saying, or like, oh, thanks for sharing that, and just moving on, or something,
Mhm. Mhm.
or I disagree, or something like this. But yeah, and I tend to think that it's unique to the toddler stage because in toddlerhood, toddlers will melt down anywhere and everywhere. There's no filter, but I think it carries on and it will strengthening those muscles of not caring early on will serve you well because as your children grow older, they will make different choices. It might not be behavioral, and it begins to build I think, muscle that says neither I nor my children need to please other people by our
Mhm.
behavior,
Mhm.
which I think is really helpful for something we talk about a lot in analyzing these resources, the off ramp when young adult children really are entering their own autonomy and agency. Like, if you've been able to practice seeing them as people who have a need in a toddler as a person who has a need from you in that moment rather than our family is performing for the people around us
Mhm.
will enable you then to see that young adult as a young adult who has a need in that moment that is your first priority, whatever they're doing. But as you said, it doesn't make it easy and it is uncomfortable. But a lot of those triggering things can be, and it's sometimes really exhausting, but opportunities for growth because
Mhm.
it's an invitation to say, well, what's going on in me that I
Mhm.
feel so whatever I'm feeling, that oh my gosh, I'm all anxious and stressed because my toddler melted down at the playground or something. It can be an opportunity to say, why is that? What is that bringing to the surface? What does it remind me of?
Mhm.
But yeah.
Yeah, and I think that looking into myself, because if I'm honest with myself, if I'm assuming that other parents are judging me, like a lot of the time that's coming from me projecting like my own discomfort or embarrassment, you know?
Mm-hmm,
Like if
mm-hmm,
I feel embarrassed by something that my toddler has done or something that my older child has said, right? Like
mm-hmm.
kids like say silly things or they do silly things or they have erratic behavior.
Yeah.
And if I'm embarrassed, I very likely am assuming that other parents are judging me for that when, like, maybe they are, but maybe they aren't. But I don't want to be embarrassed, right? Like, I don't want to have this unhealthy sense that my child is a direct reflection on me and that the decisions that they make reflect on me and because they're their own person. And if my 7-year-old uses a silly voice I find kind of annoying and I get embarrassed, like I can very easily then start to project on other people, and when it's really like internal work that I have to do on myself.
Yeah. I think it's the Connected Families on one of their podcasts. They say, parenting is not your report card. Like parenting moments are not my report card. Like, am I doing it great as a mom, And that is a really difficult mindset to break out of, especially if you're, as this person says it, a desire to people please, I think many of us are. And especially in early years of parenting there can be an insecurity about the choices we're making. And maybe this is not particularly helpful, but I think it's a different angle to come at it to say, yeah, but if you were parenting in a really authoritarian way, there probably would be other parents noticing and judging that too, and being like, oh gosh, that's too strict, so there's kind of at any route, people have opinions.
Yeah. But it's hard. It's just really, really hard.
Yeah. I hope that's helpful. Reach out if that pinged anything, the person who asked this question, if that pinged anything for you. But the next question, this is kind of a fun one, a different approach. It says, what recommendations for church children's ministry training do you have?
That's a good question. I really don't have, I don't come from a ministry background, so I don't have a lot to offer there. I will say that the Center for Faith and Children at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, TEDS, they have some great resources. That's one place that you could go look. They have a website and they're on social media. They also have a podcast. But what are your thoughts?
Well, my experience is pretty limited to what I've seen in ministry context, but I quite like it. The parishes I've been have used either Godly Play or Catechesis of the Good Shepherd. And both of these are kind of Montessori style children's worship resources that, kind of like we talked about in the last episode, mirror the church calendar and season. So it's a way of engaging children in developmentally appropriate and tactile ways with what the broader church community is doing. So I quite like those. I'm sure there are other good ones. I got a question a while back about like, what's a good children's Bible? And I may have preferences. A number of ones are probably good and adequate for children's ministry curriculum as well. I think I would more be looking for flags when I was looking at things. If it gets really heavily doctrine oriented early on, that's not really developmentally appropriate for a child's spiritual capacity. If it is really shame oriented, I would run away from that. And then a number probably depends on the people teaching and shepherding the children too, because any curriculum can be either amped up or kind of mitigated depending on the people doing it. So it's a tricky one to ask, but I love both of those. They're just the Godly Play and Catechesis of the Good Shepherd. They take children through cycles of just very simple Bible stories. And I love how they invite children to engage by, at the end, they ask wondering questions. So it isn't kind of like a Q&A, but kind of like, I wonder why Jesus asked, that person that question, or I wonder what it felt like to be Zacchaeus, or things like this that are just quite lovely to hear how children are engaging, and their observations are incredible too. So those are good ones.
Oh, that's awesome. I'm not familiar with either of those, so that's good to know.
Well, I'll link all three of those in the show notes for anyone who wants to check them out.
Cool. Okay. So the next question, this is kind of a hard one for me. I mean, what is your favorite part about being a mother? I don't know why I find that question hard. I mean, it's a nice question, but also, I don't know.
It feels in a different way. It feels like when people are like, what's your favorite book of all time? You're like, well, I don't know how to answer. There's many things.
Yeah. Oh gosh. Well, do you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, I think this is gonna. It's gonna sound cliche, but I think it's the children. The meeting these new people, these six new people, the miracle of that, and getting to know them. I love seeing the way that they change and grow, and they arrive as a little bit of a mystery, and then you're like, you see that unfold. So, I mean, many things, right? There's many things I could answer, but that's what I'm going with.
Sure. That's a great answer. Yeah. I mean, I was not someone who always wanted to have kids before getting married. So motherhood was not really something that I aspired to as a young person or a college student or early 20 something. And so I was pleasantly surprised when I had my first. I just wasn't sure how it was going to go. I was in grad school. My husband had just finished grad school, I think. And one thing that I don't know if this is my favorite thing, but I'll say this has been one of the most pleasant surprises of motherhood was I did not expect to want to stay home to be around my kids, but I wanted to be around them all the time. All three of them at every stage is sort of I have been pleasantly surprised by that, and getting to know them has been so fun. I don't know what I expected, but I think because I didn't have a vision of it in my mind, I was caught off guard by that in the best way.
Yeah, that's lovely. I think on a surfacey level too, I would add my favorite thing to do as a mom is read alouds with my kids. I love that. That's my favorite. That one's an easier one to answer.
Yes, we just did my three. Well, she'll be 4 in August, but my 3-year-old and I just did our first. I read Wind in the Willows.
Oh yeah,
aloud to her for the first time 2 weeks ago, and that's one that I've done with all three of them.
That's so sweet.
Kind of leveling up at the read alouds with every stage is always so fun because you get to revisit those favorites. That one's a funny collection.
Yeah.
So,
have you ever read, this is off topic, but have you ever read Elizabeth Gouge's novels? Oh, I'll send you the link. She has a series of novels. It's called The House. I can't remember what it is, but it's this multi-generational family story, and it centers around Wind of the Willows. That's their family lore is Wind of the Willows. So they're kind of rehabilitating this old home in the historic English country. I mean, it's gorgeous, but anyway, for Wind of the Willows fans, I will send you the link. Maybe someone out there has listened to it.
Oh, I would love to read
a fun one.
We've had a lot of fun with them. My kids just think those stories are hilarious.
Yeah.
I'm totally mystified by it.
That's great.
Cool. All right, let's see. Next question.
Okay, next one. Kind of a two-parter. We'll start with the first part. Someone says, what parameters have you found to be the norm for how spanking occurs? Okay. And I'm assuming this person means in Christian parenting practices. Yeah?
Yeah.
Is that how you interpret it?
Yeah. I sort of what parameters do these books tend to lay out for parents? So this is interesting. And I think, we've read a lot of these books at this point and can say, I don't want to defend these books, but I think one thing that is pretty clear when you read them is that in the 70s, a lot of Christian parenting authors are trying to put boundaries around the practice of spanking, right? It was sort of assumed before that at any moment, dad could just walk through the door with a belt and hit you, So there is a sense of wanting to put boundaries around the practice.
Yeah. And I think that comes through in some of the resources. I think in some of them, it seems like they are trying to, rein it in and communicate to parents not to spank in anger. That comes up a lot, which I take issue with for a number of reasons. But I do think they are trying to hold on to spank. It's interesting that they do not have the capacity to conceive of maybe we could do away with spanking and violent means to begin with, but they are recognizing a problem with unrestrained corporal punishment and sort of say, and it's weird because some of them will also joke about it in their own childhoods. They'll retell stories about being taken to the woodshed or seeing stars and stripes. We have a whole chapter on spanking in our book, and we include some of some of these dynamics, kind of explore them in depth. So it's a strange relationship because you can read between the lines of what a lot of these experts are saying, that they maybe came from a background where they were really physically abused. It sounds like that there's a lot of anger and emotion and belts and things like this. And so they are trying to say, well, we still think parents need to spank, but you should make sure you're calm, go into the other room and pray first if you need to. Typically, they will recommend, it's all over the map what they recommend. Some will say use your hand so that it's not too hard, and others will say don't use your hand so that the child doesn't associate the parental hand with spanking. Use a tool, and they recommend tools. And sometimes they will say bare bottom, other times they will say not. But all of them who advocate for it do say, it should hurt. And there should be some kind of contrition. You should be able to tell from tears or that it's been painful enough to bring about contrition. And then usually they will talk about some kind of affection, like give a hug or some kind of restored relationship. That's typically the formula in the mainstream ones. I mean, there are extremes that take it even further that I think of more as abuse manuals that come across that way. But many of them kind of lay that out. And whatever their motivations, whether they were trying to mitigate previous practices or really genuinely believed this, you get the sense that everyone's kind of pulling from each other and a little bit making it up, because there's no real reasons for this advice they're giving. They're just kind of saying, this is the good way to do it, that somehow distinguishes it from that enraged, out of control hitting. But obviously, when they try and tether it to Bible verses, it's usually something like the rod Proverbs, which have none of these ingredients. So it is kind of a free-for-all. Some will say start before the age of 1. Some will say end by puberty. Others talk about it as though spanking continues as long as you need it into the teens. So there is a sense that even the experts are kind of making it up as they go along. And certainly the way families interpreted this was all over the map. We heard a number of different things from different respondents. So the rarity would be that a Christian resource would entertain the thought that spanking might not be necessary. There were very few. There are a couple that just don't talk about it either way, one way or the other. And then I think we could probably number them by hand. I mean, Jesus the Gentle Parent obviously speaks out pretty strongly against it. Clay Clarkson's Heartfelt Discipline, that's Sally and Clay Clarkson. Sally's written a number of books. Clay has a chapter where he kind of debunks some of the rod verses in Proverbs, and they in their resources are clear that they did not spank and don't believe that's necessary for Christian parents. And then Connected Families also has they have an ebook called To Spank or Not to Spank. And their kind of approach is to invite parents to consider setting it aside, but not to trigger the defensiveness around that with parents, to kind of like help them reshape a paradigm so parents feel like they can leave that behind rather than starting with that. But really, The Flourishing Family is the first traditionally published book we came across that outrightly was taking a stand and really investing a lot of time to explain that perspective out of probably over 100 resources.
Yeah. I would say it's assumed.
Yep.
It's assumed until you get like to the end of the 90s, really, and then you start to see a lot of avoidance.
Yep.
And in that avoidance, still recommending the older ones. It's sort of like it's sort of like newer authors start to sort of avoid the subject, but recommend Ted Tripp's Shepherding a Child's Heart. Yep. So that's my theory is that's one reason why books like Shepherding a Child's Heart have remained so in circulation, because new authors know
they're more savvy.
They don't want to touch it.
Yeah.
But they recommend these older
even Abby Halbert Stott, who wrote M is for Mama, she's on an interview, she talks about this. She kind of says, because she doesn't take a stance, and she says, if I if I tell you not to spank, I've lost half my audience. If I say you should spank, I've lost half my audience. So I think it's interesting that there's a savviness there that will not disclose their personal choice. A lot of influencers, current parenting influencers, and will do it in the name of like, that's up to you. Kind of, it's an issue of conscience for families is often how it'll be presented. Karis Kimmel Murray does that in grace-based discipline. And so they'll kind of say it's up to you, which is fascinating to me because I do think it's a bit of an either or. Like if it is a biblical, if you really do believe it's a biblical mandate, I'm not sure it can be an issue of conscience. And if you don't believe it's a biblical mandate, why then,
Right.
So, but that's kind of the road. And then you're right. They will recommend Ginger Hubbard's book or Ted Tripp's book which are all about spanking. I mean, this is the primary tool. So it's kind of a covert way. And I think by far, I don't know if I do think it's changing a little bit with this generation. What would you say of Christian parents? I don't know. Do you think?
It really depends on the community.
That's a good
it really depends on the church community, I think. And because I really see both. I really do see both where we are. And people who are openly both, right? Like
that's true. And, I forget, I'm out in a part of the country where that's just probably less out, people are less forthright about it.
Sure.
But I do think, we hear from a number of people all the time where it's still just the norm in their community. Mm-hmm. They're still hearing sermons about it. Like it's not even at the level of personal choice. So for sure. Yeah. I think that's right.
Yeah. And there's a second part of this question that, Marissa, I will let you.
That's great. I'm excited to answer this one.
Did the ancient Israelites spank their children for education? Does it make sense to think they stopped spanking once the person was around 12 years old?
Okay, this is an interesting question. And gosh, I wish we could know the answer for sure. I mean, it's all real speculation, right? We don't really know what the ancient Israelites did for parenting practices. Like there's no real way to know that because what kind of evidence can we look at? We can look at written documentation. I mean, there's not really going to be archaeological evidence for this sort of thing that's going to tell us what age they started or what age they stopped. I mean, I think the historical record shows that most ancient cultures viewed children as subhuman. And yes, corporal punishment was a norm. When that started or stopped, I think is more of a question mark. And whether it looked like what we envision, I think is even more of a question mark. Because I think of things like even in the biblical record, where you have things like children not yet knowing their right hand from their left hand or right from wrong, or you have all the Hebrews are prevented from entering the land as a consequence of their continued disbelief. But all those under age 20 were allowed. They were exempt from that. So you do have these kind of clues that maybe it might not have looked as we think of it in this obey or be punished from toddlerhood on framework. These clues that like, I don't know. And certainly when I think by the time you get to the Proverbs, I think the most compelling interpretation is that this is about young men. And that certainly fits with cultures of the ancient Near East, where young men would be disciplined or caned. It fits with some of the things we see in the laws of the community of ancient Israel for rebellious sons to be disciplined. They're talking about adult sons. So it's hard to say. I think spanking is a modern concept to begin with. So the idea that there are ancient parents hitting a child's bottom or something, a very young child, I don't think so. Does it make sense to think that they stopped spanking once a person was 12? I also don't know if there's a way to answer really either of those questions satisfactorily. I do think it's worth saying there are cultures that didn't rely on corporal punishment. We can see from the records, there's some Native American tribes that Jesuit missionaries visited and that they were kind of surprised to see that the Huron of Canada did not, now Canada, did not rely on corporal punishment. The missionaries were kind of scandalized. And in turn, the Hurons were kind of scandalized to see the missionaries beating children. Dr. Stacy Patton, historian, talks about West African cultures not relying on corporal punishment. There is some documentation in ancient Egypt. You see both, like children were really highly valued and treasured and elevated in different ways. And also there's some records of children being beaten with sticks. So it's so hard to say, especially with our post-rationalism empirical lens. I just am not sure they would have even been asking the same questions. But I think what we can say with certainty is that this pattern we talked about, the norm for how spanking occurs today, is not what ancient people would have been doing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I think that's right.
And what would you add to that?
I mean, I would just add, so I am not a biblical scholar, right? Mm-hmm. So when I see a question like this, I think this person is asking because they want to articulate that this is unclear, right?
Right.
Sometimes I see a question like this asked.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes I see questions like this used to sort of like basically proof text the practice. Like if ancient Israel was doing it, then we should be doing it too. And that always bothers me because I think, I think the strongest case against hitting children is to make the case from the question, is it ethical to hit children or not?
Right.
Not does the Bible say it is okay to hit children? Because, I don't know that any of the verses that we have are like commands about parenting, first of all. And I don't know, and all of the practices outlined in the Bible do not constitute ethical practices. Exactly. So I find that way of coming into a conversation about spanking or hitting children to be unuseful as is it right or wrong? Like as a historical question, that's interesting. We can ask historians and we can look at the historical record and see that there is quite a diversity of thought. Mm-hmm. The reformers and previous church fathers try to outline these different ages of accountability for children, kind of like assuming that under the age of 7, you shouldn't expect much. And then, up to 14, they're kind of learning right from wrong. It's like, whereas a lot of the parenting books that we have now are really all about spanking toddlers, trying to like program first-time obedience into toddlers, which I really do think for most of church history would have been a weird way to think about it. I think so.
For just the fact of child mortality rates makes it less likely. I mean, I think ancient parents are much more concerned with their very young children surviving those early years. So I think much of this is just a modern question that wouldn't have existed in the same way. Right. And even the idea of stages of childhood wouldn't have existed in the same way. And I think you're absolutely right. Just because something an ancient culture did or didn't do isn't necessarily indicative for what we should do. And just because something's recorded in the Bible, which is primarily narrative, is not a green light either. There's there's a lot of bad behavior in the Bible. And that's a part of storytelling. I think this is a big problem when we want to interpret, like according to the nouthetic approach that says it's an instruction manual. It's primarily narrative. It's a story that we are to receive as we do stories, which we digest differently than a fact book. And so when we come to it like an instruction manual or fact book, we're not doing the work of hearing a story and thinking about all those dynamics. So yeah, I would agree that this, and I almost wonder if this question was asked to prompt the opposite response of like, it wouldn't make sense for the ancient Israelites to stop when the person was 12, and they probably didn't spank for education. That's an interesting term here. But similarly, I think either way, this becomes unhelpful to inform our practice. And I think added to the question of ethics for Christian parents, does this align with what Jesus showed us, what the Father is like? He modeled for us what we are to do as Jesus followers. So does it align with his teaching? I do think he, as the incarnate word, is cohesive and coherent with the word of God revealed all throughout scripture. So I don't hold to the Old Testament was the old way of doing it, and we have some sort of progressive interpretation. But I do think we come often with glasses that say Old Testament is the bad way of doing things, angry God, violence. New Testament is not. And I think that's a problematic lens as well. I think there's cohesion there. But Jesus should be the first lens for our hermeneutic, because he became incarnate. One of the reasons he did was to show us what God is like. So, and I think that becomes a really important, if we're going to prove text, a really important thing to say. When Jesus interacted with children, it was not disciplinary. It was welcoming. It was respectful. It was an advocacy of keeping them safe from adults who could hurt them. And the instruction Paul gives twice is for parents not to exasperate children, which is remarkable when you think of the ancient context where children were complete non-persons in that sense, children and women. So I don't know. And I tend to think with all of these things, similarly to the conversation about views on women in the ancient worlds, yes, subjugation of children has been the norm for much of human history, but that doesn't make it right. Particularly for Christians who hold to things went wrong early on in Eden, we can say, yeah, maybe that should give us pause. If there's nothing different between how Christians are treating their children than a number of other cultures, maybe that should give us pause.
Yeah. Good questions, everyone.
Yeah, great question.
Kind of whiplash to the next one, I suppose.
Yeah,
that's a simple one. Yeah, where did you go to school?
Yeah.
I don't know if this is referring to college or before, but I'll just kind of share. I had a weird K through 12 experience of I had all three potential things sprinkled in there. A little bit of homeschooling, a little bit of private schooling, and probably mostly public schooling. Okay. So in early elementary, my mom homeschooled for a couple years, and then I went to a small private Christian school in North Carolina, and then into public school, and had good experiences all around of those. And then I did my both my undergraduate and my PhD at the University of Iowa in Iowa City.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't know that about your early years. That's fun. Yes, so my family moved around a good bit. So I went to a number of different private schools as a child, both Protestant and Catholic schools. Great education there. And then I went to a Torchbearers Bible School, Ravencrest, for a year after graduating high school. Before going to Wheaton College for my undergrad, I studied sociology and ancient languages there. And then I went to Columbia International University for seminary and at a master's in theology with focus on church history there. That's in South Carolina.
What's Torchbearers School? What is that?
Okay, so Torchbearers was a man named Major Ian Thomas started these kind of a network of international Bible schools mid 1900s, and they were kind of related to the Keswick movement, so victorious Christian living, if that means something to people listening. And I actually met him the year I graduated from high school and pivoted as a result. Bless my parents, because I was set to go to college, and I ended up graduating a year early. So I was quite young. I was 16 at the time. And so maybe they were happy for me to have a gap year. I'm not sure. But I met him and I really found it compelling, his message. And I'd wanted to go to, there's the biggest of the schools called Capon-Rates in the UK. And they're typically just a year of basic Bible, book studies and kind of a pretty evangelical, not generic, but basically you're learning basic hermeneutics, exegesis, stuff like that. But I was too young to go to the internet to study overseas at that point. So I ended up at one in the mountains of Colorado, which was really delightful and a great gap year. I'm thankful for my time there. But yeah, so, and I think the schools are still around. I don't know. I mean, it's 20 years later. So I don't know if I would recommend them still. I'm not sure, but I had a positive experience in the 90s there.
Are they denominationally affiliated?
I don't think so. I think they're interdenominational and they get a lot of international students, which is kind of a cool vibe, and people of all ages, like some people just taking a year to go study the Bible intensively. So, yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Never so heard of those. If people out there listening have been, message me and we can be like, oh yeah, it's kind of funny when you you run into people who have some connection there.
Yeah.
Because it's kind of a little niche.
Cool. Very cool. All right. Next question. What are some healthy Christian parenting books you enjoy?
Yes. So we kind of last episode, if you're interested, we kind of talked about why we're reticent to recommend resources from our platform. But we're going to treat this question just like personally speaking, like Kelsey, as a mom, what were some ones that you found helpful kind of thing?
Well, so
did you find any? It's okay probably to be like, I didn't find any.
I did not find any of the Christian parenting books that I read when my youngest was a toddler. I did not find them helpful at all, which is partly why we're writing this book. It started me on this path. But I mean, I will say, we mentioned it in the last episode, The Flourishing Family by David and Amanda Erickson is a great new resource that I'm happy to be able to recommend for people who are looking for a specifically faith-oriented resource. I do not feel strongly that my parenting has been most helped by faith-oriented resources. I will say Emily Hunter McGowan's new book, Households of Faith, is great for casting a vision of what a family is for. I loved that book. Personally, I really like the work of Tina Payne Bryson and Dan Siegel. I do not know what their faith background is, but I like the books they've written together and apart. I know that they are not perfect. I know that there's some pseudoscience in there. And but those are not claiming any spiritual mantle, so I won't pick them apart here. But I did find them helpful in terms of giving me a language of developmentally appropriate behavior and non-shame based discipline practices. Yeah, so I don't know. Good. What would you say?
Well, it brings a funny story to mind. I remember, my books are all going to be older, but I remember as a new mom, I probably had like a 2-year-old. Reaching out. I'm just laughing thinking about doing this now because I should have seen it coming. Reaching out to like a dozen other young moms I knew at the time and being like, wouldn't it be great? Again, this is pre-social media era. So wouldn't it be great if we could share resources? Like, what are your favorite resources? And I'll compile a list. And so they all sent them in, but it was the first time I realized how personal what you're drawn to is, because on this list were books I had never heard of that I know now, like To Train Up a Child, Shepherding a Child's Heart, and then some secular resources. If I could find it, it would be funny to see what else was on there. And I realized at that moment, I had heard about To Train Up a Child. I knew enough that was a flag. And I had to divide my list into ones where I was like, these are ones other people have said that I haven't read. These are ones that I'd recommend. It was the first time I realized the wide range of things. I read a number of parenting books early on. I can't remember a lot of them, so those probably weren't helpful. The ones that were, I did read Clay Clarkson's Heartfelt Discipline when my children were young, and I found that helpful because it was a Christian framework that offered an alternate way. And I quite enjoyed a lot of Sally Clarkson's books, and still do. I appreciate her a lot. I say that with the caveat that once I gave one of hers to a dear friend of mine who read it, gave it back to me, and was like, I am exhausted after reading that book. So I really do think there's a personality vibe there. There's an idealism to her books that I think for some people is energizing and for other people is not. So I say that with that. For me, at different times, it has been energizing, and at times it's felt like a lot, like too idealistic. So, but they were helpful to me in young years, but they also maybe give a lot of ideals to aspire to. And then much later on, I discovered Connected Families. I mean, and my kids, they're age spread is quite big. There's 13 years between my youngest and my oldest. Is that right? Yeah. So I discovered them when my younger kids were young and wished I had had that resource early on. That's still one I recommend and really appreciate their perspective and the equipping they offer. Beyond that, I liked, this isn't a Christian resource. I don't know how it still holds up. I liked How to Talk So Kids Will Listen, How to Listen So Kids Will Talk. I think that's it. They have a couple ones. They have one for like toddlers, one for teens. I liked that. I think I read The Explosive Child and found that helpful. And The Whole-Brained Child. Those are secular resources. I don't know if I'd be like, greenlight everything, read all these with discernment. But those are ones I remember finding helpful at different times.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that I've started saying this all the time now, but the personality thing, I think, is just such a big deal in terms of what resonates with you.
Yep.
It's so, because I kind of feel similarly about the Sally Clarkson stuff. Like it seems just too idealistic to me. Right. But then some of the resources that I like are also idealistic, but with just in a different way. Yeah. Some people really like the work of Emily Oster. She's a researcher who does a lot of like the data-driven kind of parenting stuff, like her book Crib Sheet or Expecting Better. Some people find that like data kind of risk management approach very empowering. Other people find it again, totally exhausting and overwhelming with information. Yeah. And I think that both are valid responses to that kind of thing.
And some of it depends on what stage you're in and how it lands with you. Like if you feel like you now have a to-do list or not. And again, this is part of the kind of things we thought about when we were creating a metric. It's an appendix of our book, and we hope to have it as a downloadable resource available soon. Just kind of questions to ask, to sift through as you're reading a resource or thinking about listening to a resource, because I think all those things matter. Like, does this energize me when I read it, or do I feel like I'm failing or like I have to do a lot more? And that can be helpful because some of it is very subjective. I think there are a number of things that I think can be clear, like how does this resource speak respectfully of children and parents? Like that's huge. But beyond that, there is just, a lot of personality stuff.
Yeah. Let's see.
We're doing well. Look at us getting through. Okay, the next one. What, if any, resources you read included anything about disability, especially developmental? Not much.
None. None. Yeah. James Dobson occasionally acknowledges it as a possibility. But the places where he does,
it's really disturbing.
It's quite disturbing. Yeah. Because he observes it in his practice, right? Like he is trained psychologist, so he has worked with kids with developmental disabilities and learning disabilities, but he is usually pretty quick to brush off those as potential explainers of behavior that he doesn't like. Yeah. And unfortunately, I think a lot of the writers of these, especially like newer-ish ones, are probably fall in the camp of like people are over-diagnosing their kids with stuff in order to explain their bad behavior. I think there are a fair amount of authors who probably fall into that camp of thinking. So no, that is one place where there is a gigantic gap in the Christian literature on parenting children with disabilities.
Yeah, and we didn't even... In our book, we kind of just state that because there's not even content to engage with in most of these books, like good or bad. It's just absent. And some of that tracks with a one-size-fits-all parenting approach, like every child, every family should be operating this way, God's way. I think you're absolutely right that the nouthetic, so many of the resources were nouthetic inspired or regurgitating nouthetic thought. And that very much does not hold to kind of diagnoses from other sources. So those were, I think you're right, seen as excuses. I mean, John MacArthur last year was saying this from the stage, like there's no such thing as ADHD. There's no such thing as OCD or PTSD. Right. I think, Dobson in Dare to Discipline, he has a really disturbing, he describes how autistic children were like behaviorally managed by keeping them in darkness and then like kind of isolating them in dark. And so I don't have a sense of the history of the history of diagnosis to know, was that normative practice in Dobson's day and he's just observing that, or was he kind of out of bounds, kind of like off the deep end there? I don't know enough to know. And then a few resources maybe would have like a nod to what they would maybe identify as special needs, but everything would be lumped in there. So that might be physical or developmental disability. Sometimes that's where they would talk about adoption or things like, so it kind of like would cover anything outside of what was being presented as the one size fits all family. And most often the resources would only do that nod to say that shouldn't be an excuse. Like that you might need to just be even more consistent with these children. There are a couple that talk about that with adopted children, which, as I'm reading it, you're clearly thinking there's probably attachment concerns going on here. There's probably a lot of reasons for the behaviors the parents are writing in, maybe in like a Q&A section, these kind of things would show up. But the experts would kind of be like, nope, the principles still apply because these are God's principles. So you just need to escalate in a certain way. So it's really tragic. It's really unfortunate. I will be curious to see if any of that changes as the awareness grows, but I'm not optimistic because, as you've said, I think Christian communities often are skeptical of outside resources. And even just seeing, for instance, how Abigail Schreier's book was really roundly recommended on the Christian parenting influencer circuit as kind of a like, see, book, here's an expert saying, a secular expert saying what we've known all along, overdiagnosis is the problem, and I do think there's a conversation to be had about overdiagnosis. And over medication. I don't want to like either or this. I don't think it has to be an either or conversation, but seeing that made me be like, oh yeah, I think that strain is still pretty strong. I mean, worth noting, Sally Clarkson did write maybe 5 years ago or so, a resource with her adult son, kind of talking about neurodivergence and their journey with that. So there are a few, and again, it kind of aligns with the parenting experts that are more, already their framework is more, consider the unique needs of your child, have, flexibility, take in temperament into account. The people who already have that pattern are much more likely to address it in whatever the language of the day would have been than the ones who are hierarchy of the home, obedience is the goal, behavior is the goal, because there's no excuse at that point. I mean, Ginger Hubbard even is like, even if a child's sick, you should still spank them. There's no excuse, like she's very clear. She says that almost exactly. So, Yeah.
I one point when Dobson is talking about disability, he does say like you said, there might be even more, authority required there, because he says, I don't want to say this is a direct quote, but it is something along the lines of, it is like a fundamental need of every child to be controlled, to have their behavior be controlled. And so if a child's behavior is out of control, like they need to be controlled. So he sort of sees it as like an extra challenge that parents must overcome, but like parental authority still has to come out on top of whatever that challenge is.
So I think too, I wonder if when he's talking about strong-willed and a lot of these resources, when they're talking about strong-willed children, if that becomes the catch-all for any kind of neurodivergence or disability, so that becomes the vocabulary parents in the community are using. And some of that is maybe they didn't have a clear sense. I mean, I think it's also fair to say those conversations weren't happening in broader culture as widely as they are now. Not to defend these resources, but that just there wasn't the kind of awareness, there wasn't the kind of range of diagnoses. Even in my years of parenting, I've seen a huge shift from when my oldest were young. It still was the era where there were very specific behaviors you were told to watch for autism or something like this that is wildly changed in 18, 20 years. So when you're going back to the 70s and 80s, even more so. And then I will say sometimes it's interesting because there's the one size fits all parenting approach in these resources, but sometimes these special needs circumstances are viewed with like angelic idealism. So there are a few resources like Vision Forum has a talk on this, or some of the others where it's like, or Above Rubies, where the parents are lionized for adopting or having special needs children, and the parents are kind of on a pedestal, and the children are in theory, right? Like there's something special about the children, but it doesn't change the methodology. So there's kind of a weird reverse, it's another kind of dehumanization, right? Like it's somebody up on a pedestal. So that pops up occasionally, but mostly it's just a big blank nothing. And we do hear from a number of current parents that actually becomes the gateway out of this kind of teaching for many of them, is having a child who they were able to discover, either get a diagnosis, or they trusted their intuition of like, this is not working. And for them, it became the unraveling of all of it. Whereas if they had maybe quote unquote compliant children all the way through, they would have still stayed in those frameworks. So yeah, it's a big gap. So hopefully people will be stepping into that soon.
I
hope so too. And I see some of that. We hope to interview Sunita Theis. Is that how you say her last name? I'm not sure. She is active in this space on Instagram. We share some of her stuff. We hope to interview her for this season of the podcast or next season. We're not exactly sure which, but so hopefully we'll hear more from, I think she more has a pulse of what that looks like in the current moment. So that would be good.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk with her. Okay, next question. We have 2 left, so I think we can do this. Okay. How did you get into the pitfalls of Christian parenting? Let's see. We've kind of talked about this elsewhere, like the origin story of the book.
Yeah.
But I mean, I can sort of, maybe we can kind of each answer personally how we started like picking at the surface of it, Yeah. I mean, I've said this elsewhere before, but for me, the dive in, the entry point was reading Shepherding a Child's Heart when my oldest was a toddler, and being very troubled by his treatment of sin and toddler behavior and kind of disinterest in dealing with the personhood and autonomy of toddlers. I just did not see that the language that he used there struck me as really unhelpful, and I was looking for some other framework to talk about behavior and just couldn't find anything. And there was this, sort of every unwanted toddler behavior was defiance, right? Or was rebellion. And I just wasn't sure that's what I was seeing. And so I kind of started picking at the surface and just found that a lot of these resources have the same kind of ideas about sin nature, children, accountability, that are simple and straightforward, but not necessarily very closely examined and recycled over and over and over again. So that was my entry point.
Yeah. And I think for me, as I mentioned earlier, I think early on, it came on my radar that there was a whole range of Christian parenting books, but I really came at this through the lens of abuse in Christian communities. So as I wrote a novel set in the stay-at-home daughter movement in a dominionist subculture. And as I was researching for that and probably being, because I've homeschooled off and on over the years, being in that community, being a little bit more aware of some of the extreme versions of Christian parenting frameworks, was kind of rumbling around in my imagination. So when I was writing that book was right around the time, oops, sorry, that's my phone going off. That's for my messages. Text messages, you'll be back soon, you'll see. Yes. Okay. That was rumbling around in my spiritual imagination. And then, or in my imagination, not spiritual, just in my imagination, as I was hearing stories of abuse within Christian context, so separate from the book within my own denomination and elsewhere. And for me, there just seemed to be very strong parallels between what I was hearing survivors of abuse navigating with church family systems, with pastors who couldn't listen to their injury, that were defensive, that were triggered, with institutions kind of shoring up their reputation. To me, that really paralleled what I also was hearing from, within a ministry context, adults navigating extended family relationships, of unable to have authentic relationship with older parents, and parents experiencing a lot of shame and confusion of why their adult children maybe were going low or no contact, things like that. So for me, it more was a curiosity of how have direct teaching these Christians have received contributed to this. And so all those kind of strands together made me be like, oh, we need a book that shines light on this, because it hasn't for Christian parenting teaching yet. And but this has betrayed so many people and continues to, and shapes them for how they engage in church families. So it's just exponential. So that was kind of how I got into it.
Yeah. All right, last question. Did either of us experience any evangelical parenting techniques as children?
An understandable question.
Yeah.
that I at least intentionally, I don't try and dodge it, but I think it's important to state, like, our work is not memoir. Like, there are people who write memoirs around these kind of issues, and I think that's important and good to have those conversations, but ours is more observational and critical analysis of primary documentation and hearing from interviewees and others. I grew up in an evangelical context. I grew up in a Christian family. And then, as you heard, even from my school story, in a lot of evangelical subcultures. So there's certainly things in my personal experience that touch on different dynamics or are adjacent to them in different ways.
Yeah. I mean, I feel similarly, not because there's like skeletons, but just because our work is not, is not reaching back. And I would say, like, my motivation in this book does not come from my personal experience with these resources. Like, I'm not coming from a place of feeling like I was personally harmed by these resources in my home, even though they were, some of them were present. I can say that my parents read many of these books. But I mean, the most I usually say publicly about it is I feel like I got very lucky that I had wise parents who were sort of able to pick and choose things out of these books and leave a lot of it. When I look back and when I read the stories of people we interviewed or who responded to our survey, I do not see my experience reflected there. And I consider myself lucky because of who my parents were and how they were as parents. I also was a very compliant child. And so I think, my personality probably also shielded me from some of that. But yeah, like I think both of us can have said before and can confidently say this work does not come out of processing our own trauma. And that's not like a way to toot our own horn or anything, but that's just not the motivation here. The motivation really comes from having observed some things. Right. I write for a very evangelical publication, Christianity Today, so I intersect with this subculture a lot in my research and writing. And as a parent, I started just noticing some things in some of the resources that come out of here. So yeah, I think we don't mean to dodge that, but it's just sort of to, again, reiterate that's not where the book is coming from. And you'll see that when the book comes out as well. We just don't do a lot of processing of our own stuff.
We do hope, too, that our book will be accessible to even people outside the evangelical context. I mean, obviously, it's very clearly hooked into certain frameworks and beliefs and theologies unique to that. And there are themes that aren't unique to that environment, right? Like, people outside of evangelicalism spank their children into compliance or have difficulty and estrangement later on in adult years. And so I think, too, there are touch points that don't necessarily require you to have been under these teachings or to have parented by them or to have received them as children, you still may find touch points with this. Anyway, an understandable question. I think we'll probably get it a lot. And so it was helpful to have to think through it and be like, oh, yeah, what do we want to say on this front?
Yeah.
So thanks for that.
Yeah.
One other, that was our last question. One other thing I just wanted to mention, we do get fan mail through our podcast provider, which we can't respond to. So I'm not going to read them all now. There was only one that seemed like maybe the person would have liked a response. Sometimes people just write in sharing their experience or saying how they're engaging with what we're saying, which we love. But someone early on, I think with our Shepherding a Child's Heart episode, wrote in, they wanted to let us know about biblical counseling approach. And I'm trying to find where they started. Oh, they basically wanted to clarify that there are different generations of biblical counseling. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that here, that is accurate. I think most of the resources we are examining are from the first generation, which is why I typically reach for the term nouthetic counseling, because that is most closely associated with Jay Adams. But for that person listening, thanks for writing in. And for those of you listening, yes, some ACBC counselors or biblical counselors today are from a different generation of biblical counseling. However, I would still say it's all rooted in Jay Adams stuff. So even if their contemporary counterparts aren't fully as exclusively Bible only as Jay Adams was, those are still the roots. And certainly those are what we see on the pages of Christian parenting teaching. So
yes.
Can speak to that more. If you have questions about that, feel free to message more or email.
Yeah. Yes. Hey, we did it.
Did we do it? We got through them all. I hope we didn't miss anyone.
Yeah. If we did, send them again message one of us on Instagram or send a message via Buzzsprout. We love doing these, and we'll do another one. We're gonna wrap up this season. This season will just be kind of through the middle of this summer, and then we'll be kind of in book release prep world after that. But we will hopefully do a season 2, fingers crossed.
We have some fun interviews coming up and a couple more resources we want to do. We haven't forgotten about Growing Kids God's Way. It's coming. We got a couple others. We'd love to hear from you. We're going to close out the season with another Q&A, and also keep sending us resources if you'd like us to maybe take a look for season 2.
Yeah, absolutely. Lovely to talk with you as always.
It is. It's so great. Thanks for this time, Kelsey. And thanks for joining us, listeners, here in the church library.
See you next time.
We are so glad you've joined us in the church library today. This is Marissa Franksbert.
And Kelsey Kramer McGinnis. And if you liked what you heard here, we think you'll be interested in reading our forthcoming book, The Myth of Good Christian Parenting: How False Promises Betrayed a Generation of Evangelical Families.
You can pre-order it now wherever books are sold, and it'll be on shelves in October of 2025.